And Howard Koch, who's normally a very cool, collected type person, comes up to me and his hands were going up and down like a Singer sewing machine.
Clint Eastwood has spent more than 70 years inside Hollywood. 7 decades of cameras, scripts, directors, and co-stars. 7 decades of premiere nights, awards ceremonies, and industry events. But in all that time, through all those years, he never let Hollywood define who he was. He never let it shape his values, dictate his friendships, or determine how he moved through the world. While other actors built their careers through friendships, alliances, and carefully cultivated social circles, while they networked at parties, formed tight bonds on set, and created lifelong relationships with their peers, Clint chose something entirely different. He chose distance. Not the distance of anger, not the distance of rivalry or competition, not the distance of ego or superiority, just quiet, deliberate separation. To Clint Eastwood, respect never automatically meant closeness. You could admire someone deeply, recognize their talent, appreciate their craft, and still choose to keep them at arm's length. Admiration didn't always lead to friendship, recognition didn't require intimacy, and professional respect, well, that could exist entirely on its own, without ever crossing into personal territory. Over the decades, there were a handful of actors he stood beside, men he worked near, legends he shared the same era with, the same industry, the same challenges. Men who, from the outside, seemed like natural allies, natural friends. But Clint still chose to keep most of them at a distance. Not out of dislike, not out of judgment, but out of something deeper, something more fundamental to who he was. And the reasons why reveal far more about Clint Eastwood's character than any headline, rumor, or Hollywood myth ever could. Today, we're looking at 5 actors Clint Eastwood respected deeply, but never let get close. 5 legends who walked similar paths, faced similar challenges, and yet never became part of Clint's inner circle. And more importantly, we're exploring the deeper values, the fundamental principles that shaped those decisions. Because for Clint Eastwood, distance was never accidental. It was never random or careless. It was deliberate. It was moral. It was rooted in a very specific understanding of who he was and how he wanted to move through life. And sometimes, it was absolutely necessary. James Garner and Clint Eastwood spent their careers standing on remarkably similar ground. If you look at their bodies of work, their public personas, their reputations within the industry, you'd think they were cut from the same cloth. And in many ways they were. Both were calm. Both were steady. Both carried themselves with a quiet strength that didn't need to be performed or announced. They didn't chase attention. They didn't compete loudly. They didn't need to prove who they were to anyone watching. They simply were who they were, and that was enough. They came from similar backgrounds. Working class roots, military service, a deep understanding of hard work and discipline. Neither man was born into privilege or handed their success. They earned it, one role at a time, one decision at a time. From the outside, they looked like 2 men who should have naturally become friends. 2 men who would understand each other instinctively, who would share stories over dinner, collaborate on projects, maybe even become close confidants as they aged through Hollywood together. But they never did. They worked in the same town, on similar projects in overlapping circles. They attended the same events. They knew the same people. They faced many of the same industry challenges, the same pressures, the same expectations. And yet there was always space between them, always this invisible line that neither man ever quite crossed. Not tension, not hostility, not competition or resentment, just distance. Clean, clear, respectful distance. James Garner represented something very different from the typical Hollywood stereotype. He came from genuine hardship. His mother died when he was young. He was raised by family members who struggled. He joined the Merchant Marines at 15, then later served in the Korean War, where he was wounded twice and received 2 Purple Hearts. This wasn't a man playing at toughness. This was someone who understood real struggle, real sacrifice. He valued humility. He wasn't fascinated by fame or status. He didn't collect celebrity friends or chase industry power. He was known for being kind to crews, respectful to everyone on set regardless of their position, and genuine in a way that was increasingly rare in Hollywood. In many ways, he and Clint were remarkably similar. They shared values, they shared perspectives on what mattered in life and what didn't. They both rejected the artificial glamour of Hollywood in favor of something more authentic, more grounded. But there was one key difference, one fundamental distinction that created the space between them. Garner believed in openness, in being approachable, in letting people in, connecting with them, building real relationships. He was warm. He was social in his own way. He believed that part of being a good man was being available to others, being generous with your time and your energy. Clint didn't. Clint valued privacy above almost everything else. He trusted slowly, if at all. He kept emotional distance from nearly everyone in the industry, not out of coldness, but out of a deep need for personal space, for boundaries, for protection of his inner world. To Clint, privacy wasn't antisocial, it was essential. It was how he maintained his sense of self in an industry that constantly demanded more. He respected Garner deeply. He recognized what Garner represented, what he stood for, how he conducted himself. There was genuine admiration there, real recognition of a kindred spirit in many ways. But he never crossed that invisible line into friendship. To Clint, admiration did not require intimacy. Shared philosophy did not require shared life. You could recognize someone as a good man, a talented actor, a person of integrity, and still choose to maintain your distance, still choose to keep your world small, protected, separate. They stood side by side in Hollywood history. Both became icons, both left lasting legacies, both represented a certain kind of American masculinity that Hollywood kept returning to decade after decade. But they walked separate paths. Two men who understood one another perfectly without ever needing to get close. Two men who could nod across a room with complete understanding and then go home to entirely different lives. And for Clint, that was exactly how it should be. To audiences in the 1960s and 70s, Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson looked like mirrors of each other. If you watched their films back to back, you'd see the same archetype repeated. Silent, intense, unbreakable, men of few words but profound presence. They both built careers on stoic characters and raw, undeniable presence. The kind of men who didn't talk much but said everything through their eyes, through their posture, through the weight they carried on screen. They were both box office gold because audiences believed them. They weren't acting tough, they simply were tough. People assumed they would connect naturally, assumed they'd be friends or at least friendly, that there would be some kind of mutual recognition, some bond between two men walking such similar paths. But in real life, they were far more different than anyone expected. Charles Bronson, born Charles Buczynski, came from brutal poverty. He was one of 15 children in a Lithuanian immigrant family living in the coal mining towns of Pennsylvania. His father died when Bronson was 10, and young Charles had to go work in the mines himself to help support the family. He worked underground in darkness and danger, breathing coal dust, risking his life every day, earning just $1 per ton of coal mined. That experience shaped him permanently. It carved itself into his bones, into his psyche, into how he saw the world. His toughness wasn't performance. It wasn't something he turned on for the camera. It came from genuine pain, from real survival, from years of living on the edge of disaster. Clint's toughness came from a different place entirely. It came from discipline, from military training, from a personal philosophy of self-control and emotional restraint. Clint grew up comfortably middle class, played basketball and piano, went to college. His toughness was chosen, cultivated, refined. It was a way of being he developed consciously, not something forced on him by circumstance. Bronson carried old wounds everywhere he went, deep wounds that never quite healed, wounds from poverty, from discrimination against immigrants, from years of being told he wasn't good enough, wasn't American enough, wasn't worthy. Those wounds followed him on screen and off screen. They informed every character he played. They colored every interaction he had. Clint respected Bronson's strength immensely. He recognized it as authentic, hard-earned, real. But he also sensed that it came with anger that never fully quieted, with bitterness that simmered just below the surface, with a kind of pain that made closeness complicated, maybe even dangerous. Charles Bronson was guarded in a different way than Clint. Where Clint was private by choice, by philosophy, Bronson was guarded by necessity, by old trauma. He was suspicious, he was slow to trust, and even slower to forgive. He carried grudges, he remembered slights. He built walls not just for privacy, but for protection against a world that had hurt him repeatedly. Clint didn't judge him for that. He understood where it came from. He could see the logic of it, the necessity of those defenses given Bronson's history. But he also didn't step into it. He didn't try to breach those walls. He didn't attempt to get close to someone whose closeness came with such complexity, such weight. Their distance wasn't personal. It wasn't about dislike or disrespect. It wasn't hostile in any way. If anything, there was probably a mutual understanding between them, an unspoken recognition that they operated differently despite surface similarities. It was philosophical. It was about different ways of being in the world, different responses to hardship, different definitions of strength. They were two men who represented different kinds of toughness, one forged through chaos, through survival, through pain that never stopped teaching its lessons, and one shaped through control, through discipline, through conscious choices about who to become. Clint admired Bronson. He respected what Bronson had overcome, what he had achieved, how he had survived and thrived despite everything stacked against him. But admiration never turned into closeness, never became friendship or even real acquaintance. Because some people you respect deeply, you recognize as warriors in their own right, you honor for their strength and their journey, but you instinctively know you're meant to keep at a distance, not because they're dangerous, not because they're bad people, but because your paths, while parallel, are fundamentally separate. Because the energy they carry, the wounds they bear, the way they move through the world, it doesn't align with yours. And for Clint, that was exactly how it should be.
Lee Marvin was chaos wrapped in charisma, wild, unpredictable, magnetic in a way that was impossible to ignore. The kind of man who could dominate a room the moment he stepped inside, who commanded attention without even trying, who made every scene he was in feel more alive, more dangerous, more real. Hollywood loved him for that, absolutely loved him. Directors called him authentic, raw, fearless. Producers called him electric, one of a kind, irreplaceable. Audiences couldn't look away when he was on screen. He brought this primal energy to everything he did, the sense that anything could happen, that the script was just a suggestion and Lee Marvin might take things in an entirely different direction at any moment. He was a genuine war hero, served in the Marines during World War II, fought in the Pacific Theater, was wounded in action at Saipan. 21 fellow Marines in his unit were killed. Marvin was hit by machine gun fire in the buttocks and sciatic nerve, severing the nerve and leaving him with lifelong pain and disability. He spent 13 months recovering in naval hospitals. So his toughness, like Bronson's, was absolutely real. It wasn't Hollywood manufacture, it was earned in blood. But behind the scenes, that same energy, that same wildness that made him compelling on screen, it came with storms, serious storms. Drinking that went far beyond social, explosive moods that could turn violent, self-destructive behavior that blurred into every part of his life, professional and personal. To many people in Hollywood, that was part of his legend, part of what made Lee Marvin Lee Marvin. The drinking, the fighting, the unpredictability, it all fed into the myth. It made him seem more authentic, more dangerous, more real than the polished, media-trained stars who carefully controlled their public images. Stories circulated constantly. Lee getting into bar fights, Lee showing up drunk to sets, Lee becoming verbally or physically aggressive with cast and crew, Lee spiraling into binges that lasted days, and Hollywood, for the most part, tolerated it, enabled it even, because the results on screen were worth it, because Lee Marvin drunk was still more compelling than most actors sober. To Clint Eastwood, it was a line, a clear, bright line he had no intention of crossing. Clint believed fundamentally that a man should be in control of himself, especially when others depended on him. especially in a professional environment where your lack of control could cost other people their jobs, their time, their safety. He believed that discipline wasn't just a personal virtue, it was a responsibility to everyone around you. He didn't moralize about it. He didn't give speeches about proper behavior or lecture anyone about their choices. He didn't criticize Lee Marvin publicly or privately. That wasn't his style. He simply chose not to move closer, chose to maintain distance from someone whose life operated by such different principles. Clint respected Marvin's talent enormously. He could watch a Lee Marvin performance and recognize the raw skill there, the genuine presence, the way Marvin could inhabit a character completely. That respect was real and undiminished by Marvin's personal struggles. But he refused to romanticize the chaos, refused to see the drinking and the violence and the self-destruction as somehow authentically masculine or admirably rebellious. To Clint, that was Hollywood nonsense. That was the industry's tendency to mythologize bad behavior because it made for good stories. To Clint, toughness wasn't recklessness. It wasn't volatility. It wasn't force without restraint or power without control. Real toughness was responsibility. It was showing up. It was doing your job well. It was being someone others could depend on, day after day, project after project. Toughness was composure. It was knowing how to carry weight without letting it crush you or spill over onto others. It was strength in service of something beyond yourself, not strength as an excuse for chaos. It was knowing when to hold back, when to exercise restraint, when to say no to another drink, another fight, another destructive impulse. That, to Clint, was where real strength lived. And in that fundamental difference in philosophy, in that different understanding of what it meant to be strong, to be a man, to be professional, the distance between him and Lee Marvin became permanent. Clint didn't judge Marvin. He didn't consider himself better or more evolved. He just understood that they were not meant to stand in the same place, that their paths, while both leading through Hollywood, were heading to very different destinations. Lee Marvin died in 1987 at age 63, his health destroyed by years of heavy drinking and smoking. Clint attended the funeral out of respect for a fellow actor, a fellow Marine, a man he had shared an era with. But they had never been close in life, and Clint felt no need to pretend otherwise in death. Some lines, once you understand why they exist, should never be crossed. Clint Eastwood and Burt Reynolds were both leading men, both movie stars in the truest sense of that term. Both commanded the screen, carried films on their shoulders, defined what American masculinity looked like for millions of viewers around the world. In the 1970s and early 80s, they were arguably the two biggest male movie stars in Hollywood, box office giants, cover stars, icons. They both had that indefinable quality that made cameras love them and audiences pay to see them again and again. But they came from entirely different worlds, entirely different philosophies of what it meant to be a star.
Burt Reynolds played to charm. He was laughter and charisma and public presence. He loved performing, not just on screen, but in life. He enjoyed attention, thrived on it. He was brilliant at talk shows, constantly entertaining, always on in the best way. He could work a room, tell a story, make everyone feel like they were part of something fun and exciting. He cultivated friendships with other celebrities. He dated famous women. He made sure everyone knew he was having a great time being Burt Reynolds, and people loved him for it. They loved his openness, his humor, his willingness to be vulnerable and human and occasionally ridiculous. Clint did the absolute opposite. He avoided the spotlight whenever possible. He didn't do talk shows unless contractually required. He didn't chase applause or validation from audiences or critics. He gave terse interviews, avoided celebrity parties, kept his personal life intensely private. He preferred the quiet corners of any room instead of the center, preferred directing to acting because it let him work behind the camera, preferred his ranch in Carmel to any Hollywood gathering. To many people in Hollywood, Burt Reynolds was magnetic. He was what a movie star should be, accessible, entertaining, larger than life. He made stardom look fun and easy and desirable. To Clint, Reynolds was simply going in a completely different direction, Not wrong, not inferior, just different. They never feuded, there was never any public or private clash between them, no competition or rivalry or bad blood. They occasionally said complimentary things about each other in interviews, they acknowledged each other's success and talent. They just never aligned, never had any reason to become friends or collaborators or even friendly acquaintances. Both successful, both respected, both legends of their era, but built on two fundamentally different philosophies about what it meant to be in the public eye. Reynolds believed in performance as a lifestyle, in giving audiences access to who you were, or at least a version of who you were, in being generous with your time and your personality, in making people feel good by sharing yourself. Eastwood believed in privacy as a right, in keeping clear boundaries between public work and private life, in letting the work speak for itself without commentary or explanation, in being deliberately unreachable in certain ways. And sometimes the greatest distance isn't created by conflict or competition. It's not created by anger or resentment or wounded pride. Sometimes the greatest distance is simply created by difference, by two people looking at the same profession, the same opportunities, the same spotlight, and choosing to move through it in completely opposite ways. Burt Reynolds struggled later in life, made bad financial decisions, went through expensive divorces, faced health problems and career decline. He spoke openly about his regrets, his mistakes, the things he wished he'd done differently. Clint Eastwood continued working steadily into his 90s, directing acclaimed films, maintaining his privacy, living by the same principles he always had. Two men, two approaches, two very different outcomes. And the distance between them, maintained from the beginning, probably made more sense to Clint in retrospect than it ever had at the time. Kirk Douglas was a force of nature, driven, relentless, intense in a way that could fill an entire room, an entire soundstage, an entire production. He became a legend not just for his performances, though those were remarkable, not just for his looks, though that square jaw and those piercing eyes made him instantly recognizable. He became a legend because of the sheer force of will behind everything he did, the determination, the refusal to accept no, the absolute certainty that he could bend reality through effort and persistence. He produced his own films when studios wouldn't give him the roles he wanted. He broke the Hollywood blacklist by hiring blacklisted screenwriter Dalton Trumbo for Spartacus and putting his name in the credits. He worked constantly, making over 90 films across 7 decades. Eastwood admired that, admired the work ethic, the courage, the willingness to take risks and fight battles others avoided. That was genuine respect for what Kirk Douglas had accomplished and represented. But Douglas also had an edge that rubbed many people the wrong way, an intensity that didn't just fill rooms but dominated them. He commanded, he controlled, he made sure everyone knew he was in charge of any environment he entered. Some actors admired that leadership, saw it as strength, as the kind of alpha male energy that got things done in a tough industry, respected his willingness to take charge and make decisions. Eastwood didn't. Clint believed in quiet authority, in strength without display, in confidence without pressure, in presence without forcing others to feel it. He believed that real leaders didn't need to announce themselves, that real strength spoke softly and carried weight through action, not volume. Kirk Douglas's intensity came with expectations, with demands, with a need to be recognized, acknowledged, deferred to. He needed to be the most important person in any conversation, the center of any gathering, not out of insecurity, but out of genuine belief in his own importance. Eastwood found that exhausting and unnecessary. He had no interest in being part of circles where power was measured by volume, where every interaction was a subtle battle of dominance, where you constantly had to prove yourself or defer to someone else proving themselves. He believed a man should earn respect through his work, his consistency, his integrity, not through force of personality, not through demanding acknowledgement, not through making sure everyone in the room knew exactly how important and accomplished he was. And so, once again, admiration existed without closeness, respect without friendship, recognition without relationship. Clint could watch Kirk Douglas's performances, recognize the skill and dedication there, appreciate what he had contributed to cinema, and still choose to stay far away from the man himself. Because proximity to greatness isn't always desirable. Sometimes greatness comes with personality traits that make closeness impossible or unpleasant. Sometimes the cost of being in someone's orbit is too high, regardless of how talented or accomplished they are. Kirk Douglas lived to 103 years old, working almost until the end, remaining a force of will even as his body aged. Clint sent respectful condolences when Douglas died in 2020, acknowledging his contributions to cinema. But they had never been friends, never been close, and that was exactly how Clint had wanted it. Looking back across Clint Eastwood's long life and career, across more than 7 decades in Hollywood, a pattern becomes absolutely clear. The distance he kept wasn't about ego, it wasn't about rivalry or competition. It wasn't about judgment or thinking himself better than his peers. It was about values, about fundamental principles that guided how he moved through the world. Discipline over chaos, silence over noise, integrity over performance, privacy over publicity, substance over style, control over volatility, responsibility over recklessness. He respected many men, admired their talent, acknowledged their achievements, recognized their strengths. But he let very few into his actual world. Very few past the outer walls of professional respect into the inner circle of personal trust. Not because he felt superior, not because he was cold or antisocial or incapable of friendship, but because he understood something most people never learn, something that takes decades of living to truly grasp. You don't need to stand close to someone to recognize who they are. You don't need intimacy to offer respect. You don't need friendship to acknowledge talent. And sometimes, the strongest relationships in life, the honest relationships, are the ones that never fully form, the ones that remain at a respectful distance, the ones where both people understand that admiration doesn't require proximity, that respect doesn't demand access. Because they were never meant to be more than what they were. Clint Eastwood spent 70 years in Hollywood without letting Hollywood change who he was. He worked alongside legends without becoming part of their legends. He stood next to giants without trying to become one of them. He simply remained himself, quiet, disciplined, private, separate. And in that separateness, in that chosen distance, he created a legacy more powerful than any friendship could have given him. Because sometimes the strongest choice isn't who you let in, it's who you choose to keep at arm's length, and why.